When I got home from work that evening, I barely had time to put down my bag before my wife stood in front of me with her arms crossed and a determined look on her face. Without any preamble, she said she had made a decision and that my opinion on it wouldn't matter. I raised an eyebrow and replied, "Well, that's quite a statement. Go ahead, I'm listening." She explained that she felt we had become too attached at the hip, that we spent almost every free moment together, and that she needed space for herself. She said she had already arranged to meet a friend who was introducing her to a new colleague. Apparently, this colleague had some incredible insights on maintaining independence while balancing a relationship. She has all these women-only activities, my wife said, as if she was reading from a script. I shrugged and said, "All right, if that's what you want." She grabbed her bag and announced she was heading out right then and there. After she left, I stood there in the silence of our home, trying to process what had just happened. Something felt off. My wife wasn't usually impulsive, and this sudden declaration didn't sit right with me. Out of curiosity, or perhaps instinct, I walked over to her laptop. It was still open on the kitchen counter. I wasn't proud of myself for snooping, but something gnawed at me, and I couldn't shake it. I clicked through her browser history and saw searches like how to spice up your personal life and ways to explore your relationship boundaries. Then, there it was, articles about swinger parties and experimental relationship dynamics. My stomach tightened. This wasn't casual browsing, it was intentional searching. Without wasting any time, I grabbed my phone and called her. She picked up on the second ring, her voice light and casual. I asked her directly about the searches. She laughed it off, saying, "Oh, come on, it was just curiosity." I was reading about ways to add excitement, and those articles popped up. Don't overthink it. There were only a couple of searches on the topic, and they seemed superficial, so I let it go. But it lingered in the back of my mind. When she came home later that night, she was all smiles and energy. She told me she had a great time and casually mentioned she had already planned her next outing. This time, it was some kind of exclusive women's literary club that also focused on psychology. Can you imagine? Just women, talking about books and emotions, she said as she kicked off her shoes. I nodded, trying to match her enthusiasm, but something felt rehearsed about her delivery. As she headed to the bathroom, she left a flyer on the table. I picked it up and scanned it quickly. It didn't mention anything about books or psychology. Instead, it simply said the meetings were held every Friday at an upscale rented cottage. My brow furrowed. Why would a literary club need a private cottage? The next few days passed without much incident, and honestly, I pushed the whole thing to the back of my mind. Work kept me busy, and my wife seemed her usual self. If anything, she was more attentive and affectionate than usual. But then Friday rolled around. She left for her meeting with a casual wave and a quick kiss, saying she'd be back late. I didn't think much of it until hours passed, and she still wasn't home. When she finally walked through the door, something caught my attention immediately. It wasn't her slightly flushed cheeks or her casual demeanor, it was her scent. There was an unmistakable trace of men's cologne mixed in with her usual perfume. It wasn't subtle either, it was bold, dominant, and far too close for comfort. If this place is supposed to be women only, I said slowly, why do you smell like men's cologne? She froze for a fraction of a second before composing herself. Oh, come on. Some women wear men's cologne. You know how quirky people can be. She laughed, but it felt forced. She even went as far as pulling out her phone and showing me a group chat for the club. Sure enough, the rules stated it was an all-women space. But rules on a screen didn't mean much to me. This doesn't prove anything, I said flatly. She sighed, rolled her eyes, and said, fine. You want to see for yourself? I'll ask if they'll let you come along next time. But just know, it'll be awkward for me. Really awkward. I didn't care about her discomfort. The next Friday, I went with her. We drove out to the rented cottage, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into something I wasn't supposed to see. But when we stepped inside, I was surprised. The main room was filled with women, all sitting on folding chairs in small clusters. There were tea sets, stacks of papers, and faint chatter filling the air. It genuinely looked normal. A woman approached us, someone my wife introduced as her friend's colleague. She was well-dressed, confident, and, most importantly, wearing that same men's cologne. It clung to her like a second skin. She shook my hand, flashed me a polite smile, and then turned her attention to my wife. Everything appeared above board. No strange vibes, no secret meetings behind closed doors, just women talking, laughing, and exchanging notes. I didn't linger long. After about 20 minutes, I said my goodbyes and left. On the drive home, I kept replaying the evening in my mind. Nothing seemed overtly suspicious, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something beneath the surface I wasn't seeing. The cologne, the secrecy, the cottage, it all felt like puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit. When my wife got home later that night, she was back to her usual cheerful self, recounting funny stories from the meeting. I nodded along, made all the right noises, and eventually said, "All right, everything seems fine. All good." But deep down, something still didn't sit right. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but think, strange. All of it was just, strange. A few days after the cottage visit, I was packing my bag, ready to head out to spend the weekend at my friend's place. As I zipped up my duffel, I caught the faint sound of my wife talking on the phone in the next room. Her voice was lower than usual, almost like she didn't want anyone to overhear. I leaned against the doorframe and smirked. "Who are you whispering to? Planning a secret mission?" I joked. She turned to me with a bright smile and said, "Actually, you won't believe it. I met this girl recently. She's a volunteer. She helps out at orphanages and spends her time working in warehouses, organizing supplies and donations. It's such an inspiring story, honestly. I was thinking I might skip one of my Friday meetings and join her. Imagine how rewarding it must feel to do something genuinely good for people who need it." I nodded and shrugged. "Sounds productive. If it makes you happy, go for it." The conversation ended there, and I didn't think much more of it. But Friday rolled around, and I came home from work a little earlier than usual. I expected to see my wife in casual clothes, maybe holding some gloves or a reusable water bottle, ready to volunteer at a dusty warehouse. Instead, she was standing in front of the mirror, adjusting an elegant evening dress. Her makeup was flawless, and her hair was styled to perfection. Before I could even ask what was going on, she grabbed her purse and heels, flashed me a quick smile, and said, "I'll tell you everything later, okay?" Then she was gone. I stood there for a minute, processing what had just happened. Evening gowns and full makeup didn't quite match the image of someone working a warehouse shift. But I shook it off. Maybe they had some charity gala planned after the volunteer work. Rich donors like to feel appreciated, after all. I spent the evening minding my own business, cooking, catching up on a series, and finishing a report for work. But around 11 p.m., the doorbell rang. I opened it to find my wife and her new friend standing there. Both of them were slightly tipsy, giggling at some private joke. "So," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "Volunteer work looks different than I expected." My wife laughed and waved me off. "Don't be so serious. Come on, let's have some coffee, and we'll tell you all about it." I made them coffee and sat across the table, observing them both. Their dresses were spotless, their hair still in place, and their nails perfectly intact. "Interesting," I said as I handed them their mugs. "Not a speck of dust or dirt on you. And since when do volunteers wear evening gowns and stiletto heels?" My wife put her mug down and smirked. "You don't get it. We weren't exactly working in the warehouse. My friend brought me to a meeting. The volunteers work during the day, but in the evenings, they gather to discuss logistics. We analyze supply chains, identify shortages, and plan how best to distribute donations." She paused, sipping her coffee, and then added, "The dresses and makeup. Well, appearances matter. When you're negotiating with certain people, it helps to look confident and polished. Some of these suppliers aren't exactly the most trustworthy folks, and charm goes a long way." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. Her explanation was smooth, rehearsed even, but I wasn't fully convinced. I noticed faint red marks on her wrists, thin, irritated lines that looked fresh. "And those?" I asked, nodding at her wrists. She glanced down and then smiled sheepishly. "You're not going to believe this, but at one point, I had to carry this massive bag of bottled water. There was no other way, so I wrapped the handles around my wrists to get a better grip. Rookie mistake, I know. But hey, we got the job done. She pulled out her phone and showed me photos of a warehouse stacked with boxes, supplies neatly arranged in rows, and one photo of her posing next to her friend. Everything looked legitimate enough. After all that, she continued, we decided to celebrate a little. Just a glass of wine or two. Nothing crazy. Her friend stayed quiet for most of the conversation, nodding along to everything my wife said. But something about her demeanor caught my attention. She looked slightly nervous, her eyes darting away whenever I asked a direct question. I decided to push a little. So, how long have you been volunteering? I asked the friend. She hesitated. Oh, not long. I'm pretty new to it, actually. Just a few weeks, I think. My wife noticed the slight crack in her friend's confidence and quickly jumped in. She's still learning the ropes. Don't interrogate her like a detective. I smirked but let it slide. The friend finished her coffee, thanked me politely, and left shortly after. My wife closed the door behind her and turned to me with a tired sigh. Lately, you've been so intense, she said. It feels like you're questioning every little thing I do. Why? What's going on with you? I shrugged. I don't know what you mean. I'm just asking questions. She shook her head and laughed lightly. All right, forget it. Maybe I'm overthinking. It's probably just me. I nodded, watching her as she walked into the bathroom. Good, I thought to myself. It's better if she thinks it's all in her head. The house fell silent again, and I sat back down at the table, staring at the coffee mugs and replaying every detail of the evening in my mind. Something still didn't sit right, but for now, I'd let it go. Time passed, and the pattern continued. My wife seemed to be slowly pulling away, though on the surface, everything appeared normal. She still smiled, still kissed me goodbye before her meetings, and still chatted about her day when she came home. But she was spending more and more time away, and her explanations were starting to feel thin. One Saturday, after spending most of the day helping my father clean out his garage, I came home to find her in the bedroom, packing a large bag. Not her usual tote or purse, but an actual travel bag. I leaned against the doorframe and crossed my arms. Going somewhere special? I asked. She glanced up briefly and smiled. No, it's for the club. We signed up for an acting workshop, can you believe it? We're supposed to do this improvised play, and I'm in charge of costumes. That's why I'm bringing extra clothes, outfits for everyone. Costumes? I repeated, raising an eyebrow. Yes, she said, holding up a blouse. You know, something theatrical. One of the girls is handling props, another is dealing with stage lights. We're taking it very seriously. Her explanation sounded rehearsed, but I nodded along. She slung the bag over her shoulder, gave me a quick kiss, and hurried out the door. The evening was quiet, and I decided to catch up on a show I'd been meaning to finish. Hours passed, and she still wasn't home. It was well past midnight when I finally heard her key turn in the lock. She stumbled in, visibly exhausted, makeup slightly smudged, and hair in a messy bun. Long night? I asked. You have no idea, she said, kicking off her shoes. I'm dead. I'll deal with the bag tomorrow. She disappeared into the bathroom, leaving the oversized bag sitting by the couch. Something about the situation didn't sit right with me. I glanced at the bathroom door, listened to the sound of running water, and then unzipped the bag. Inside, buried beneath a few regular clothing items, I found a black leather whip and 2 ornate masquerade masks. My stomach tightened. This wasn't costume party attire. I turned the whip over in my hands, my mind racing with questions. The bathroom door creaked open, and my wife emerged in her robe, hair still damp. She froze when she saw me holding the whip. Is this part of your acting workshop? I asked flatly. She let out an awkward laugh, clearly trying to brush off the tension. Oh, come on. You wouldn't understand. It's a theater thing, something about symbolism and character immersion. Symbolism? I repeated. She nodded enthusiastically and then launched into a string of overly theatrical jargon, phrases about embodied performance and improvised narrative space. It was like she was reading straight from a textbook. "You're kidding me, right?" I said, holding up the whip. She laughed again. "Look, it was all part of a big joke. That colleague of mine brought them, and we all just messed around. It was silly, really. I even have photos." She grabbed her phone, scrolled through her gallery, and showed me pictures of her and her friends in costume, wearing the masks, posing dramatically. In one photo, she was laughing while holding the whip loosely in her hand. The photos looked innocent enough, but something still didn't sit right with me. As she leaned over to show me another photo, I noticed something else sticking out from the bottom of the bag, a cologne bottle. It was a heavy glass bottle, sleek and masculine. But the scent wasn't one I recognized. "And this?" I asked, holding it up. For the first time that night, she hesitated. "Oh, that. That must have gotten mixed in with my stuff when I was packing up. I was in such a rush to leave that I just threw everything into the bag. Here, I'll call her right now." She grabbed her phone and made a quick call. Moments later, her colleague arrived at our door, smiling politely. "Oh, thank you so much for finding that," she said, taking the cologne bottle. "I'd been looking for it everywhere." The whole interaction felt staged, but I played along. The colleague left soon after, and my wife closed the door with a satisfied smile. "See," she said. "Mystery solved. No big deal." But I wasn't convinced. Before I could say anything, she sighed and dropped her shoulders. "Okay, fine. I'll tell you something. She's different. She doesn't feel comfortable being feminine. She's more of a tomboy, you know. That's why she wears men's cologne, dresses in a certain way, it's just who she is." I stared at her, trying to gauge whether she was being honest. "All right," I said. She stepped closer and tilted her head. "What are you thinking? That I'm cheating on you? With her, of all people?" I shook my head. "No, nothing like that." She smirked. "Good. Because honestly, you're starting to act like one of those paranoid husbands in soap operas. In any case, I always have explanations, don't I?" I didn't respond. She turned away, pulling her robe tighter around her shoulders. "Look, it's late. I'm tired. I have a big event tomorrow, something important. I'll tell you all about it once I know the details. For now, let's just drop it, okay?" She turned and walked towards the bedroom, leaving me standing in the living room with the open bag still at my feet. I watched her disappear down the hallway and thought to myself, all right, let's see where this goes. The next morning started like any other, but something still lingered in the back of my mind from the night before. Over breakfast, as I was putting on my tie and getting ready to head out to work, I casually asked my wife about this important event she'd mentioned. She didn't hesitate, answering with her usual energy. "You'll never guess," she said with a sly smile. "I decided to organize a bachelorette party." At the theater workshop, we all started talking about our pasts and reminiscing about how bachelorette parties were such a fun way to let loose and forget about responsibilities for a night. So, we thought, why not recreate one? Just a bunch of us girls, wine, music, and some silly party games. I nodded, sipping my coffee. "Sounds lively. When are you planning to leave?" "Late evening," she replied nonchalantly. "It's going to be an all-nighter, and in the morning, my friend's husband will drive everyone home. He's already arranged everything, so you don't need to worry." The idea of her being driven home by someone else didn't sit entirely right with me, but I kept my expression neutral. "All right. Have fun," I said, grabbing my keys. On my way to work, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her story made sense on the surface, but the pattern of odd details and vague answers was getting harder to ignore. During my lunch break, I decided to reach out to the husband she mentioned. After a few exchanged messages, we ended up on a call. He sounded easygoing, and we clicked almost immediately. "Why don't you and your friend join us tonight?" he suggested. "We'll do our own version of a guy's night. Beer, video games, football, the works." It sounded harmless enough, and honestly, I liked the idea of keeping a closer eye on the situation, even if indirectly. I called my best friend, Mike, and asked if he was free after work. He agreed without hesitation. After clocking out, Mike and I drove over to the address I was given. It turned out to be a decently sized house in a quiet neighborhood. The guy opened the door, all smiles and handshakes, and ushered us in. Inside, the atmosphere was relaxed. The living room had a giant TV, a gaming console hooked up, and a table overflowing with snacks and drinks. The evening kicked off well enough. We cracked open some beers, played a few rounds of FIFA, and shouted at the screen during a football match. The conversation flowed naturally at first, work stories, jokes, and harmless banter. But as the night wore on and the drinks kept coming, the talk started to drift. I leaned back on the couch and asked casually, "So, you guys are all cool with this? The girls having these late-night outings, all these extracurricular activities?" One of the guys, sitting across from me with a beer in hand, let out a bitter chuckle. "Honestly, no. Not really. It's not what we signed up for. My wife started all this after taking some self-help course about empowerment and independence. It's like she woke up one day and decided that our life together was boring, predictable, stale." Another guy chimed in. "Same story here. They all found this, community or whatever it is. And every time I ask questions or raise doubts, she's got an answer ready. Always. Like she's rehearsed them." I exhaled slowly, nodding along. That's exactly how it feels for me, too. No matter what I notice, no matter how odd something seems, there's always an explanation. And it always just barely makes sense. Around the room, heads nodded in agreement. It was clear we were all feeling the same unease, but none of us had any real proof of anything concrete. It was like trying to catch smoke with our bare hands. As the night wore on, the conversations grew heavier. We tossed around theories, trying to make sense of it all. Were we overthinking things? Were we just being paranoid husbands? Or was there something more beneath the surface? Eventually, the group agreed on one thing: we'd start paying closer attention. Subtle details, inconsistencies, little slips of the tongue, everything would be noted. None of us liked the feeling of being left in the dark. By the time dawn crept in through the curtains, the night had mellowed. We were exhausted, half-empty beer bottles scattered around the room. I crashed on the couch for a couple of hours before finally dragging myself up and heading home. The husband of my wife's colleague gathered his things as well, preparing to play chauffeur for the girls. "See you around," he said with a tired smile. When I walked through my front door later that morning, the house was still quiet. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the clock as the minutes ticked by. It wasn't until almost noon that my wife walked through the door. She looked tired but happy, her hair slightly disheveled and her makeup faded. She dropped her purse on the counter and smiled at me. "You're up early," she said with a smirk. "Couldn't sleep," I replied. She launched into a detailed story about the party, how they danced, played silly games, and shared embarrassing stories from their pasts. Her words painted a vivid picture, and her tone was light, carefree. I listened, nodding along at the right moments, but my mind was elsewhere. Pieces of conversations from last night swirled around in my head, mixing with her words. Eventually, she yawned and stretched her arms above her head. "All right, I'm exhausted. Let's go catch up on some sleep." We headed to the bedroom, the curtains still drawn to keep the daylight out. She fell asleep almost immediately, her breathing deep and even. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my mind still restless. The night had given me more questions than answers, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. But for now, I let it be. The day would bring its own revelations soon enough. After that night, things took a sharp turn. My wife became more distant, her conversations more guarded. She stopped sharing details about her plans, and her responses became vague whenever I asked where she was going or who she was meeting. It wasn't even subtle anymore, it felt deliberate. That's when it clicked for me: either one of the guys had let something slip, or she'd caught wind of our little plan to keep a closer eye on things. Either way, one thing was certain: she had something to hide. I knew confronting her directly wouldn't work. She was too good at spinning stories, too quick on her feet with explanations. If I came at her head on, she'd just twist it around and leave me standing there with nothing but more questions. I needed proof, something undeniable. That's when fate decided to step in. Out of nowhere, my boss called me into his office one afternoon and told me I'd need to travel to another city for 3 to 4 days on a work assignment. It was almost too convenient, almost scripted. But instead of seeing it as an obstacle, I saw it as an opportunity. That evening, over dinner, I casually mentioned the trip to my wife. "Looks like you'll have the house all to yourself for a few days," I said, watching her reaction closely. She barely flinched, just gave a polite smile and said she'd miss me. It felt fake, hollow. Later that night, as she scrolled through her phone on the couch, I hatched my plan. I walked over, phone in hand, and sighed. "My battery's dead, and I forgot my charger at Dad's. Can I borrow your phone to give him a quick call?" She hesitated for half a second, a brief flicker of something in her eyes, but handed it over. I locked myself in the bathroom, phone in hand, and started digging. At first, there was nothing. Her messages were clean, her social media accounts showed nothing suspicious. But then I checked her Google Calendar. And there it was, an event scheduled for the weekend with a bold title that read, 18 plus time away from husband. My stomach dropped. The casualness of the phrasing made it even worse. I couldn't confront her about it, not yet. She'd just find another smooth explanation, some clever twist of words that would leave me questioning myself. No, I needed more. I needed to see it with my own eyes. When I returned her phone, I acted normal. I even made small talk about my upcoming trip. But inside, my mind was already racing, formulating a plan. The next morning, I made a quick stop at the pharmacy. I bought a specific chemical agent, something I'd read about online a long time ago. It was designed to ruin condoms in such a way that anyone using them would face permanent consequences. Extreme. Maybe. But if nothing was going on, then it